Viktor Korchnoi has sacrificed a piece to get to this position against a fellow named Peterson. Black seems to have enough defense, and the king will quickly walk to the queen side if left unmolested, but by using a capture check, Korchnoi forced mate in 3. King must capture. In response to the check, the black rook and knight are just in the way, so the king must move back. And now that the bishop is gone from e7, knight f6 is not just a fork, but a checkmate. A simple example of finishing off a king by sacrificing for an important defender. This pretty little example is not well known, but it shows how Lasker could finish in style. Sure, he's already 2 pawns up, but the position is rather random. Neither king feels particularly secure, but Black's king has a lot more to worry about. At the moment it has no moves at all. The question is, how to finish it off? Lasker starts with the capture check. Well, what was his opponent to do? Mr. Forbes Robertson has a double-barreled name and 2 possible moves. He chose to capture the rook, perhaps not noticing the brilliant move queen to a7 check. The rook captured, and then the king was checkmated. Of course, he could have taken with the king, but in that case, checkmate still follows very quickly. The queen comes in protected by the knight. The king comes over, and here it's mate in 2. Check. Block. Mate. Of course, the initial position already had kings in unusual locations, and though White's king was a little bit exposed, Black had nothing to attack with, whereas Black's king faced the combined might of 2 rooks, a queen, and a knight. Under these circumstances, giving up a rook, even for just a pawn, is not a big deal. White's attack looks promising, especially since at the moment he enjoys a slight material advantage. This is a game from the 1924 Soviet Championship between Levenfish as white and Rosenthal as black. White's attack would be rolling along except for the fact that the rook at f3 is pinned. The white rook at g1 is up against a counterpart at g7. So it seems that somehow the queen is going to have to do all the work. First thing to do is get rid of the defender of the black king at rook at g7, and that can be accomplished with a capture check. Obviously, black is going to recapture. And now the queen goes to work, forcing the king back. It doesn't really matter which square the king retreats to. It went to f8, was forced back to g7, and now comes the hard part. It looks as though White's attack is just going to be with the queen, and an unassisted queen is unlikely to force checkmate. How can that pin be broken? Well, white could move the king, but it would take a couple of moves because the rook at the moment is undefended. How can white finish off this position? The diagonal is blocked by pushing the pawn to d5. This is the key in white's plan. The pin is broken, and it's mate in 7 even with the best play by black. In the game, Rosenthal chose to capture with the knight, but then it was a simple mate in 2. Going back to the position after d5, queen takes d5 would only have prolonged the agony, because after the check, king is forced back, and here the queen does deliver a solo checkmate, but she had some help from the rook. This is a good example of using a pinned piece, the rook at f3, to support some other action. A pinned piece isn't necessarily useless. You might recognize this position because it's a very famous one. Aaron Nimzowitsch played white against Sigbert Tarrasch at the famous St. Petersburg tournament of 1914. This is a very instructive position and shows the power of forcing moves combined with subtle moves that nevertheless leave the opponent with very little choice. There are 2 possible sacrifices to get things going, one at g2 and one at h2. Well, our method says we should look at the capture with check first, and indeed that prime candidate is Tarrasch's choice. The sacrifice must be accepted, because if the king moves over, then queen h4 is terminal. So, the queen comes in with check, and white has no choice. Now what? Most of you probably considered this sacrifice when looking at the position, but how can black continue? No rooks in the play, just a queen and a bishop. There doesn't seem to be any follow-up, but there is. Remember that although capture checks are our primary concern, we always look for other captures and other checks. And here, the checks with the queen aren't going to do us much good, but there is a bishop captured. It's a sacrifice, but so what? As a matter of fact, it's a sacrifice that must be declined. White can't take the bishop, but has to avoid mate at h1. Of course, it's not easy to see all the details in advance, but if the bishop was captured, a check forces the king onto the h-file, and now the rook lift to d5, headed for h5, is the theme that brings victory. There's a desperate way to stop things. White can offer up the queen. After all, 2 pieces ahead already. Take the rook, add it into it. Not bad. But the clever checking move means that black captures with check at this point, and then when the king moves to the g-file, there's a nice little fork that picks off the knight, and white has such a material deficit that there's no point in playing that line. However, white has an alternative. Although the king is boxed in at the moment and queen h1 looks deadly, Nimzowitsch just pushed the pawn up to f3. Now if the queen comes down and gives check, the king will just escape via f2. So it's time for a quiet but deadly move. There will be no escape across the e-file. When you're chasing down a king, you want to cut off escape routes whenever possible. that means you have a smaller area of the board that you need to control to win the game. Now, there are a number of moves that white could try here. Let's look first at queen d3. The problem is that queen g3 sets up a discovered check, and there's a checkmate following. So, try another one. Knight e4 was the move actually played in the game. But before we get to that, let's go back and look at contesting the e-file. That can be dismissed rather quickly. The capture checks allow white to grab the bishop, but notice that white's pieces are pretty useless on the queen side, and after a check and a rook lift, it's all over. Finally, just in case you hadn't noticed, taking the bishop is mated in two. So, Nimzowitsch chose knight e4. That blocks the e-file, but the king is chased, and black recovers a little bit of material, and black's up exchange, and white's got nothing going on. Well, no way to take back on f1, because then the queen falls. So, Nimzowitsch opted for d5. At least this opens up the power of his bishop, and if he can play queen c3, maybe he's got something going there. This is an important move because it frees f7 so that now black's king can escape, just as white's king escaped to f2. It's a rather nice artistic point to this game. Of course, Nimzowitsch loads the gun. Nimzowitsch is hoping that his queen will get to g7 with checkmate. However, it is Tarrasch who has the forced mate. And now, a last sacrifice, yet another capture check. Now, some people say that Tarrasch announced mate in 5 here, but in fact it's mate in 3. A check, another check, limiting the space for the king, and then checkmate. Before we leave this position, let's go back to the position after f5. There is another check. Knight f6 check. But that's where the king gets to make use of the square that was freed up on the previous move. And as far as the rook is concerned, who cares? White still can't take the bishop because of queen h2 skewering the queen. Again, black wins. A nice example from the great St. Petersburg tournament. There were many other fine examples there too.